Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to join the presentation today and be engaged as EA practitioners from industry, government, academia, and other fields for this important conversation. We acknowledge that IAIA, the International Association for Impact Assessment, Western Northern Canada board members live and work across Western and Northern Canada on lands that are home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Further to that, we acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of the policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. We both respect and affirm the rights of all Indigenous people across this land. I'm wondering if Matt Hammond is on the line to give us a bit of a, Matt Hammond is our president. He was going to provide a bit of an intro to IAIA-WNC. But if not, I'm happy to do that. I'll just continue on. My name is Jeff Rempel. I'll be moderating today's session. I work for a company called Hatfield Consultants. We're a medium-sized independent environmental consultancy working across Canada, providing environmental consulting services. Personally, I cut my teeth in impact assessment in the early 2000s in Arctic mining and have project managed and led a few major EAs in pipelines and marine terminals since. I'm an IAIA WNC Executive Committee Board Member and Program Director. The IAIA WNC membership is just $30 for individuals, and for those that don't have your membership, I would really encourage you to do so. There's lots of great opportunities for us to have conversations and disseminate information to keep the industry informed as well as ourselves, and lots of great events as well. So please stay tuned for future events in your local regions. Soon to be announced in Calgary, where a couple of us are, including George and myself. We're looking to have an in-person holiday mixer on December the 6th, so stay tuned for that. How did this session come about? Well, George and I and a few others met for what we called cumulative effects beers around Stampede Week this year, talking about the current and very real challenges in impact assessment, noting climate change objectives and the time it takes to have meaningful engagement with Indigenous nations, regulators, and other challenges, of course. Recognizing that Canada is aiming towards 2035 net zero goals, and we need infrastructure to support the transition. And noting that 2035 is just over 11 years away. There are opportunities for the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada and for industry to integrate considerations for critical projects over the next decade. And now here we are today together. I've been attending the Electrical Transformation Canada conference over the past few days, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard in very well-attended sessions repeated concerns about regulatory and permitting challenges. These noting that they're designed to protect the environment, but taking too long to be approved, and we need faster action, ultimately to protect the environment by getting critical projects and infrastructure approved in the near term. For today's session, a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to ask that participants keep their microphones muted. I'm not sure that you have a choice. I think that that's by default, and that questions be entered via the Zoom software chat. I'll do my best to keep track of the questions and bring them forward to George, likely at the end of the session. We have nearly 300 participants registered today and only an hour, so I'll do my best to address the questions as possible. Please note that you can also upvote questions posed by others. Again, please keep all the questions respectful and focused, noting recent Supreme Court decisions, limit any political grandstanding, and keep it focused on the content here today. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce George Hegman, Vice President of Environmental Services with Stantec Canada. George is a specialist in environmental impact assessment for major resource and infrastructure projects, including oil and gas, pipelines, transmission lines, wind, and green hydrogen. His historical geographic focus is in Western Canada, Western and Northern Canada. He has also provided advice, guidance, and training to federal and provincial and territorial governments on boards, on projects, and regional and cumulative effects assessments. I'm sure George is not an unfamiliar name to you, and we really appreciate him taking time to help guide us and to generate some conversation here today. So welcome, George, and thank you for taking time to present on this timely subject, aptly named Solving the Streamlining Paradox, the Future of Environmental Assessment. An annotated section from your abstract states that we are aware that Canada and the world are rapidly maneuvering towards an energy transition. with calls for expedited regulatory project reviews, process to meet domestic and international challenges. This seminar will examine regulatory streamlining challenges, both in process and practice, and offer pragmatic and balanced solutions to the streamlining paradox of reducing time, but also gaining trust. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Jeff. Just a quick sound check that you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Good day. Thank you for participating. I'm humbled to be here today to offer my thoughts from which hopefully positive and constructive action may ensue. And I would like to thank the Western and Northern chapter of the International Association of Impact Assessment for facilitating this session. I have approximately 30 minutes of presentation. While there are slides, they are minimalist in content and predominantly are there as section headings in my talk, with, for some, providing a brief list of some key points. More importantly, after that, there will be time for questions, and as such, I encourage you to submit them. The thoughts expressed here are my own, reflecting almost 30 years as a consultant environmental assessment practitioner for many major resource projects across Canada, subject to many jurisdictional and regulatory process, and reflecting my ongoing efforts to keep abreast of the substantial literature with no more than a modest contribution, myself, and what I have heard and learned from other consultant practitioners also from across Canada. Nothing I say here is in association with any projects previously, now, or in the future under regulatory review for which I'm aware. My comments are generic to project types and regulatory process, although understandably in Canada, the federal process has garnered the most attention. Lastly, a trigger warning, if you will. There are things said here that likely outside of consulting practitioners, many will not have experienced, heard of, or thought of at all. That because so much of what for decades, and certainly noticeably the last years, has been what I refer to here as the dominant narrative from other origins regarding what environmental assessment is, how it works, and how it should work. While, and as later reiterated, all views are needed here. And I continue my efforts to rebalance that narrative with messaging from the front lines, which certainly I believe is critical in contemplating and implementing streamlining. In the October 13th Supreme Court of Canada decision, Attorney General of Alberta versus Attorney General of Canada, concerning the constitutionality of the Impact Assessment Act and its physical activities regulation, Chief Justice Wagner, channeling 4 previous court decisions, opined that, quote, the environment by its very nature is complex and diffuse, unquote. For the purposes of my presentation today and for the characterization in general of what nationally lies at the root of our mutual conundrum and of our paradox, little more than that statement is necessary. It's all there. The driving forces of human development and natural and anthropogenically induced change are challenged in our response, certainly by those complexities, but more so by the heart of the matter. Our human ability, with all its limitations and opportunities, to respond to those challenges through the invocation of multiple mechanisms, including administrative, legal, procedural, policy, program, regulatory, research study, political, all which to varying degrees, the process and practice of environmental assessment are entwined. And as if the Supreme Court decision was not late-breaking enough, that decision barely a week ago spawning much impassioned debate across the multimedia board and spectrum of opinion. I vote, by the way, for the word opine to be the Oxford word of 2023. But today, the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security released a 49-page report making international headlines with the equally impassioned exhortation that, quote, we are moving perilously close to the brink of multiple risk tipping points. Human actions are behind this rapid and fundamental change to the planet, unquote. Let us then now begin to see in what collective way we can better, by at least some small measure, respond through environmental assessment. Calls for streamlining are not unique to Canada. Similar initiatives are happening in the United States, United Kingdom, and EU. The energy transition has caused a shift in the human development imperative, Homo sapiens' desire to build stuff, a shift subject to a timeline impelled by a unique global urgency and requiring new versions of physical works and activities in meeting. In Canada, the Government of Canada's critical mineral strategy is a leading example of this. Mining continues to proportionally dominate projects under federal environmental assessment review. As such, an apparent contest, a natural resource industry to supply everything we want to maintain a benchmark lifestyle, is also so in the natural resource sector with oil and gas, versus a global ecosystem that also supplies everything we want, notably, as the understatement of the day, air, water, and soil. Imagine, however, that instead of versus, a clash, it was accommodated within, that is, the development embraced within being good shepherds. Now, will that global urgency translate, and if so, how, in changes to environmental assessment that has evolved for decades and continues to evolve, in which the rallying cry for change starts with time, that is, duration of review to decision? Before I clearly state what is the paradox I allude to, and indeed notwithstanding the common perception of what streamlining is, to carry on from above and to properly start, it is first necessary to answer and understand the most critical question of all that is not being asked. What really is environmental assessment and why? Without an answer to this, we will be unable to proceed and adequately and fairly advance such assessment. And the reasons we cannot adequately proceed is because otherwise we don't quite know what it is for which acceleration is to be applied. And within that, what actually constitutes the universal desire for balance between development and environment. And at least to that end, what role environmental assessment can play. There is, of course, a common thread amongst innumerable definitions. Fundamentally, environmental assessment is to provide good information for decision makers to make good decisions. After that, however, on details, much is left for debate. I proffer a deeper view that environmental assessment provides a platform on which to make compromises in land and resource management, and an even yet deeper view that environmental assessment is a reflection of intrinsic human empathy to keep both our natural life support system intact and human machinery to allow us to exist and better thrive in that environment. That empathy is not some philosophical aside, but a salient imperative as to why we are where we find ourselves due to the understandable, but at times pursuit of more. Project reviews that take many years with uncertainty on both evidentiary standard of what actually constitutes enough and adequate information, evidence in the parlance of frontline practitioners, in both the breadth it encompasses and for each the depth it plumbs. What is missing and hence needed and missing from much of the current dialogue on streamlining, separate to the current erstwhile dominant examination of process, is on the nature of information keenly seen by practitioners who prepare and subsequently defend the original filing, a vantage point largely hereunto unrecognized as a contributor, with relevant insight and understanding of what it really means to do environmental assessment versus observations, commentary, guidance, and expectations formulated from some distance to that. There is nothing quite like doing to know what to do. To that end, to all non-practitioners, I lay down my challenge when faced with the spectrum of assessing effects on Earth and the sweeping spectrum from ion exchange, energetics at atomic scales, to biogeographic changes, to biodiversity at macro landscape scales, and it is assess this, where this is essentially everything around us. Environmental assessment requirements and what they say, their story, in the context of regulatory project applications remains unclear, notwithstanding a variety of guidance and guideline, large expectations, and theoretical postulations. As such, directionally, in the well-intentioned desire to match environmental assessment information to the challenging complexities at stake, the path environmental assessments are going, is based on a calculus that good environmental assessment equals, by default, consideration of a universe of all possible outcomes to near endless expanse of detail and certainty, which I will later argue as both unreasonable and at least certainly counterpoised to streamlining. There is no argument that the many matters raised and desired to be explored in environmental assessment and the depths of that inquiry represent real and important matters to acknowledge and address. Practitioners are acutely aware of this. But there is a quantum difference between reality of complex natural and human systems and ambitious interpretations versus the means by which they are examined as hard evidence in a regulatory project application. In short, much so far of where environmental assessment is going is fundamentally opposed to streamlining. Clearly, something needs to give, but then hanging there before us is in what form? To simplify a thing, one must first start with understanding the assumed nature of complexity of the thing to be most simplified construction, already a simple thing. You take a project, you understand what it is and what is around it. You look for and are told what the project may affect. You analyze the effect to understand it. You look for means to reduce the effect. Assessment complete, you're done. Well, so for things so apparently simple, why in reality do they become protracted affairs into the point that for some exceed bounds of duration so as to stymie not only the procedurally fair advancement of a project, but stymie the advancement of a larger cause within which the project is entwined, such as projects directly supportive of an energy transition? Of many answers, there are a few clearly dominant. Without an understanding of how much information is enough, there's only one apparent direction: to seek more. With increasing recognition of important and real biophysical and human community effects of concern, if not hazard, there's only one apparent direction to go: to add more. With increasing desire for open and transparent engagement, information, trust, and risk management, there's only one apparent direction to go: to seek greater certainty. The above and more come with a combined procedural effect. They take more time, and nothing has appeared to go the other direction for less until possibly now. Given the understandable refutation by many of that loaded term less, with its implication of avoidance of grappling with ever more urgent universal repercussions of humanity on Earth, I offer a replacement: a measured less. By measured, I allude to the following essential keys to streamlining. Concordance, that what is assessed is clearly a consequence of the project. Proportionality, that the degree to which things are assessed are commensurate to providing an understanding of the effect and its management within an accepted degree of uncertainty. Containment, that every time yet one more notion arises of one more thing to include as information requirement, that its inclusion is first tested by weighing the theoretical with the pragmatic. Clarity, that whatever is assessed is clearly understood as to what it is and how to assess it. Collaboration, that the means to facilitate is through improved mutual engagement, including jurisdictionally, notably provincially. Adoption, that options are judiciously selected from a precedence-proven palette and elevate their use, such as proven mitigations. It would be unbefitting of me as a practitioner, as is our lot, to not be more helpful to above to make it real by way of example, to make a necessary fine point, to improve communication, to explicate, to make defensible, to rationalize. As such, I offer the following common generic situations, places that practitioners repeatedly end up, that being a dead end for want of knowing in what manner to proceed, which translates into questionably needed additional time, and equivalently for the reviewer to know at what point to concede that one has gone far enough, and hence, if truly enough, is indeed enough. In all cases, the streamlining path forward is to accept currently available information, also with the understanding and acceptance of elucidated gaps, assumptions, and uncertainties. Let's look at surface water. The baseline is done to the extent possible. Numerical plume modeling is done to the highest current standards from which in-stream concentrations are calculated. Natural variability taken into account, uncertainties, gaps, and assumptions stated, best available technology committed to, effects on fish from all this assessed to the extent as ever possible for biological receptors, but temporal and spatial extents are deemed inadequate and must be expanded to include populations of fish beyond the original deemed adequate boundaries and for fish not recorded as being there, and next available field window not till next year. Gender-based analysis. Assessment of effects on community health are to reflect disaggregated human subpopulations by identity factor, except such disaggregated data is typically not available, cannot be made available in a reasonable period of time, and challenging to the point of not possible to obtain given the sensitive personal nature of such information. Biodiversity. The project occupies a relatively small site in a short linear corridor, a road, in a region with substantial other resource development. An assessment of biodiversity has been made through characterization of project-caused change and loss of vegetation ecosites. However, intervenor request and passed on as an information request is the analysis and derivation of multiple biogeographic metrics such as patch, connectivity, and edge within a 1,000 square kilometer region, but the data to support such an analysis is not available nor apparent what the beneficial use and meaning of such information would be in subsequent decision-making, aside of generating great tables of numbers and many colorful maps. Effects on Indigenous right. Of 23 Indigenous groups engaged, five have overlapping traditional territories that together represent, in the context of traditional use and hence rights, a de facto new regional study area up to 600 kilometers from the project, within which to discern tangible and intangible effects, the latter for which current means to characterize and assess are unclear and simply not available. The paradox of streamlining, reflecting an argument counterpoised to the previously stated erstwhile dominant narrative, is that there exists the possibility that good information for good decision-making may actually be attainable by a measured modification and reduction. In short, that less can be more. Further, it's not a case of asking for less information while still expecting the same or more, and hence a loss or diminishment of the current near endless pursuit of universal issues to exacting, if not perfect degrees of certainty, but instead an adjustment to make sought after information better aligned with, proportional to, and representative of potential project effects and their management. At the moment, instead, what we have are environmental assessments wielded to, and to varying degrees, behave as agents of introspection and influence on matters exceeding their cause-effect domain and thrust into the role of playing larger roles for which environmental assessment was never originally meant to address, nor necessarily should be. The flares have already been sent skyward. Multi-year proponent time by multiple years, exceeding ostensible advertised regulatory clock time. Proponent requests for more time to process yet even more inquisition of evidence, notable through repeated cycles of post-filing information requests in pursuit of some elusive enclave of knowledge. Guidelines approaching a page count to a point indicative of less customized, concise, and proportional information request and more prescriptive-based presupposition on applicability of universal desires and preordained assumption of effects, a de facto case of guilty before proven innocent. Planning tasks before actual commencement of assessments that dutifully, given the extended time and volume of material now typically being expended, to become prototypes of the eventual actual formal assessment. We must task ourselves with answering two basic questions, for which neither have been asked or answered as I'm aware. First, if the historical average and maximum outlier number of years for a project application to complete its course through the regulatory application review process is unacceptably too long, then just how many lesser number of years is acceptable? If we sense or know that a certain number is too long, then what is okay? And then what becomes too short? Second, if it's unclear and arguably expansion is now just what more limited degree of information pursuit and the nature of its subsequent interrogation is adequate and represents a good environmental assessment, does anyone actually know and can agree on what a good enough environmental assessment looks like beyond we'll know when we get there, if we get there, whenever that is? To the above I offer, and before diving into more details, the following answers. In regards to the years of review process, there is no readily apparent answer, and arguably a number is not attainable, nor should there necessarily be one in the form of some singular absolute metric. Instead, the answer is found in going down an alternative path, namely, that a reasonable time period should be that which reflects a process, and practice that through its introspection, allowing current conventions to be kept or tossed, which in a renewed and modified way exercises a variety of options to ensure project effects are assessed that deserve assessing, that pursuit acknowledges uncertainty, and ultimately decision-making compromise is procedurally fair to proponents, is open, transparent, and responsive to community concerns, and offers solutions to issues knitted to the project, but less so beyond. As such, if a project review takes 6 instead of 3 years, then the reasons, motivations, need is openly apparent and eminently sensible and required. In short, justified, makes sense. In regards to the extant doctrine of expansionist environmental assessment, the answer is found in first recognizing the many pragmatic limitations, again forcefully apparent to practitioners, in assessing complexity in terms of data limitations, limitations of knowledge, both as Western science and traditional knowledge, limitations of analysis, limitations of mapping, limitations of proponent resources, including schedule and budget, and uncertainties that run throughout the quixotic quest of perfectionist detail. As mentioned, the majority of streamlining options so far focus on process, that is, opportunities that avail themselves from the nature of administrative, regulatory, and legal processing of an application. The following possibilities are examples raised in no particular order. Keen observers of many of these will note an emerging theme of enhanced collaboration and clarity. Reduced types of projects, physical activities subject to review and/or the threshold for which they are engaged, this being a key component of the Alberta appeal based on constitutional division of authority on natural resource projects and the ensuing Supreme Court decision. Of note is that the majority and arguably the most influential anthropogenic activities in Canada to environmental and other outcomes are not currently assessed, starting with human centers of occupation cities that drive resource demand. Improve multi-jurisdictional, such as federal provincial cooperation or harmonization, including accepting, perhaps with some amendments, adequacy of provincial permitting and assessment process to lead. Extend changes beyond just the regulatory authority and into the larger government departmental family. Strengthen a tiered and united process from screening to assessment to tribunal review with full or partial off-ramps for some information, such as regional assessments and greenhouse gases. Expand inclusion of information in support of permitting to extent possible and reasonable to reduce subsequent post-filing time to secure permits. Rationalize and implement an improved basis of identification of directly affected Indigenous groups, so certainly some, but not equivalently necessary for dozens, is often the case. Introduce and implement class assessments for some types of projects. Cease time recording only on government clock time to recognize the extent and reasons for additional proponent time as constituting the full extent of elapsed time. Move from risk adverse to risk management administrations. Supplementing process-based options are those which are technical practice-based, a lens powerfully seen by practitioners. As such, to no surprise, dominated by a theme of clarity and constraints, an otherwise unfettered evidentiary scope, again in no particular order. Provide guidance on assessments of effects in the context of pragmatic assessment versus theoretical. Using sustainability as an example, notwithstanding that there is some available guidance, that it's embedded in the Act, and that it's a matter for which all can agree as to its importance in generalized conviction, and which has been entreated over years with government and scholar attention, nonetheless remains vexing for practitioners to actually determine what, if anything, to say and assess as defensible and new evidence, especially given that environmental assessments already in what they do are fundamentally powerful vehicular transports towards sustainability. It is with interest that the Supreme Court themselves professed equal wariness and uncertainty regarding this term when they opined that sustainability is, quote, an abstract concept that, much like the environment, is constitutionally abstruse, unquote, which then begs how the term made its way into the Act as one of, if not its primary driver, and how it is being propelled as one, if not the brightest lighthouse to which information requirement should aspire when the Supreme Court themselves find difficulty in understanding its place and what to do with it. In a similar fashion of importance, critically important and well-intentioned but short of needed clarity, notwithstanding some available guidance, are means to assess effect on Indigenous right, a vast and complex evidentiary space for which remains much to adequately define. Continuing on, provide guidelines, information requirements customized to truly correlate to the projects under review. Adequately define terms in the context of pragmatic assessment versus theoretical versions, such as holistic, interconnected, ecosystem approach, cumulative effects, sustainability, intangible human perceptual response, biodiversity, social determinants of health, gender-based analysis. One cannot and should not assess a thing if there remains lack of laser clarity on its meaning. Again, not from an academic origin only, but building on that important start and transmute it into a meaning that represents a thing that now can be assessed because it resonates in the real world of regulatory evidentiary requirement. Standards of practice must reflect practitioner input, lest they risk reflecting weakly defined, unattainable, indefensible, and endlessly debatable evidence in the context of regulatory applications. Focus assessment on effects relevant to the reviewing body's jurisdictional authority. This, of course, another key component in the Supreme Court decision for federal reviews. Impose limiting metrics, such as page count limits. Yes, that has been suggested in some places. Or brief by all current precedents the period of time for assessment completion, with the caveat that information requirement is commensurately focused. Only seek advanced numerical models, geographic information system mapping analysis, and statistical analysis when it truly offers tangible value by supplementing other forms of information with meaningful insight towards improved understanding. Do not escalate fieldwork requirements to that of multi-year research programs in pursuit of fundamental science and/or filling gaps of land and resource management authorities. Elevate acceptance of certainty for implementation of proven precedence-based mitigation, such as from codes of practice. The government to rise above the now decades-old procession of judicial reviews on Indigenous self-determination and rights and inform industry proponents instead of leaving for them to alone figure out clearly in what manner they as such are obligated to act in consideration of those important decisions, government policy, and adopted international conventions such as UNDRIP FPIC. Adopt and use the concept of evidence as the fundamental basis of filed information. So start actually using that term with all the gravitas it means and deserves. Accept that environmental assessments are not research projects and is often viewed by practitioners the alias of doctoral thesis, and hence accept that some effects may remain uncertain. That is why there subsequently is decision-making. To make unbalanced decisions, that is always have to admit that often, if not always, in some form, to gain one thing, you have to accept loss of something else. Improve the understanding of how Indigenous knowledge, as with Western science, carries within both great power and limits, and exercise either to the maximum extent available. I now wish to explore a thought experiment by tearing environmental assessment down to its roots and for the sake of illuminating options and eschewing convention through purposeful provocation as a challenge to the Gordian knot of streamlining. There come moments when it can be instructive to simply admit what a dressed-down version of environmental assessment can look like, not because I believe there is any chance it would, in the form presented in its totality, see the light of day, but instead to serve as a provocateur of thought to then birth what may come from laying matters threadbare and better reflect the shopping about for successful examples elsewhere, or at least already promulgated and tested, from which may perhaps some elements be adopted towards streamlining goals. The following explains this. There are two gates to pass through. The first gate is a phased assessment approach that starts at a conventional screening level, which at its core is what are the effects and what are you going to do about them, jumping clean over the insatiable desire to assess in detail because we don't need to. That because we have seen this before, this being the construct of physical activity plus effect plus mitigation. Next, if, as may happen on occasion, there are effects left wanting for its characterization and hence proven mitigation, we pursue with great determination to discover how to address as a priority analysis. Next, also, if, as may happen on occasion, any one or more of a variety of ambitious pursuits entangled with matters for which the project may be engaged, where many such issues arise from larger policy and legal fields, or simply in highly unique situations, a separate study is made. But again, because argument to do so comes from the context of the project in the world. On the last point, in reminding all of my intended provocation, I will now speak heresy, which perhaps given my long association on the subject matter may surprise some. Imagine the expungement of the assessment of cumulative effects from regulatory project review and off-ramp to regional assessments. By the way, that as already advocated, that is the use of regional assessments by a growing chorus. As with other specialty topics that have become or are assuming the mantle of doctrine, the advocation of assessment of cumulative effects from a scholarly perch, and often hence adopted as former regulatory information requirement, argues that cumulative effects must be at the core, if not be the essential DNA of any assessment, an expansive, if not breathtaking in its scope, while not denying the reality of such effects and that indeed they reflect a larger version of what environmental assessments could and should be, I nonetheless to that have but one right post in response. Try it. Just try it. Not as theory, but annealed in the hard world of evidence on the public record in defense of an environmental assessment where that evidence will be interrogated against a standard despite what constitutes the nature of that standard is unclear and debatable on virtually every detail. This is not conducive to a recipe for streamlining. Repeat these comments for sustainability, and I could go on. Which brings us to the second gate, it reflecting what is already built into many regulatory review mechanisms. Notably, of great interest in precedents is north of 60 under co-management regimes under settled land claim, namely the use of a quasi-judicial tribunal to hear out the evidence, thus a bump up to testing the application beyond the written to that of human dialogue, a crucible invoked only in the most extenuating circumstances in which truly the previous mechanisms demonstrably prove inadequate to address the issues at play. In conclusion, I offer these parting thoughts. Streamlining towards time-wise expediting project reviews should be viewed as clearly the case with some, it should not be viewed as clearly the case with some, a wraith flying amok and destroying everything we have built, trammeling on the use of environmental assessment to fulsomely address the adverse implications of proposed projects and hence adequately meeting head-on the task of the challenges we domestically and globally face. Instead, streamlining should be seized upon as an opportunity to pause in the ever more rapid acceleration of expectations for such assessments that, in lockstep with the understandable and much needed responses to address equally rapid, real-time, urgent local, national, and international issues and concerns. And if such a moment avails itself to take stock of what we have and what we want, that while fully seeking out, nay, embracing all the views and arguments, allows us to mutually reconcile the complex act of environmental assessment in a complex world. And through this one mechanism available to us amongst and working in conjunction with others, truly tailor how environmental assessments are done to clothe our empathy with all we have and want in the cloth of both the finest and the strongest thread. Thank you.
Thank you, George. That was great. Very, very thought-provoking and a lot to unpack there. We do have a couple of questions that have come into the chat. I'm sure people are still thinking about theirs, and please feel free to enter one now or in the near term, and or to upvote, assuming that you can do that, and that will bump them up on the list. Right at the top, first question we have, George, is about more of a comment that you could address. I did not hear recommendations on how to build more trust through these shifts in less is more. So do you have any comments about the trust building aspect of streamlining?
I certainly, and from whoever, thank you very much for raising that.
It's an anonymous question, yeah.
Indeed, thank you. I would say that if I was offered only to provide one, maybe less than a handful of words each that most strongly depict the most important elements of environmental assessment, that word trust is one of them. Now, true, I didn't mention that. There is much left wanting in what I had gone through. I chose selectively what that may be, but that is a very apropos point. And that the need for trust in so many ways amongst all the various actors involved, an absolutely critical component, because perhaps reminding ourselves that the artistry, process, etc., of environmental assessment is only accomplished through the engagement of so many individuals and that indeed would serve as a key element in order to allow the advancement of ensuring the acknowledgement and pursuit of addressing various issues with the trust that ultimately coming out of it, that good work has been done by good people openly and transparently with all the due diligence that is expected.
Thanks for that. And I think part of it may come out of what you said about just try it. I think that there could be uncertainty in terms of, trusting in the process, and maybe through a few examples that trust could be built.
Yes, indeed. In regards to that, there is, and I would believe that I made it relatively a strong point, the act of responding to information requirement from wherever that comes from is not adequately appreciated in terms of what that really means. All the various actors involved in the environmental assessment process play extremely important roles, if not in a mandatory fashion, critically so. Everyone has their part. The part, though, in the original preparation is what starts it, and that is the assemblage of vast amount of information funneled into these reports, etc., based continuously over and over again with what is to be done in the face of various information requirement, given still unfortunately inadequately recognized constraints, which unfortunately are not given the attention that they need, and I'm hoping that can change. So just try it it's another version of a challenge. We can write, as I and others have done, and we need, and as often said, we would be in a much worse place if we didn't have advocates for pushing the boundaries of environmental assessment. We would be worse off for that. But again, from a practitioner point of view, there are limits that way. And just trying it is referring to what truly constitutes the nature of responding to those requirements.
Thanks, George. We'll move on to another question here, also from an anonymous attendee. Where there has been a shift to professional reliance, are you suggesting governments increase their resources in order to ensure there is an adequate amount of data? That government undertake more multi-year research projects, ? In other words, do you feel professional reliance has gone too far?
So the notion of professional reliance specifically, but more generally, has completely irrelevant and after a point less so relevance in the world of EA. Professional reliance being when a government authority gives authority to another body, to a private body, to conduct work fully or partially on their behalf. Forestry issues in BC and others such have occurred in the past as an example of this. Now, it has not yet been the case in Canada that a government body would pass reliance in that fashion to a private body such as a consulting firm in order to conduct some work that is specific, instrumental to the regulatory fate of an application. Because the government decision body always retains their decision-making authority. And of course, the majority in Canada, the model that we have right now, and it's not the only model, is that in the majority, for certainly larger projects and hence larger assessments, are prepared to contract between a consultancy and the proponent, which may in some cases, yes, be government. But the larger issue is, I think, the really important one, and what notionally it moves one to in a discussion. And that, again, it gets to the trust by which the various bodies engaged in the environmental assessment process, how they may best proceed. And it's an issue which certainly has received some attention, and into the future should continue to do so.
Thank you for that response. This question came up and has been uploaded many times. I'll read it out. It's from Chris. Thanks, George. I'm also a fan of streamlining, but in different ways, it seems. If I heard you correctly, you're suggesting EA processes ditch assessments of cumulative effects, sustainability, and instead stick with some historically typical VCs like wildlife, water, etc. Wouldn't this ignore where science has gone in recent decades, i.e. catching up to where Indigenous perspectives lie? The realization that everything is connected, that siloed analysis is just that. So don't we need integrative analysis to try to make sense of impacts in an integrated world?
Ideally, yes. First, going back, I purposely positioned my preposterous recommendations for the point of then poking about and testing at the premises by which we at the moment have occupied in terms of information requirement. Because thus tested, it forces us to question the need, the legitimacy, and then moving on with its meaning and the truly ability to assess. Next, it is without question, and any practitioner would completely agree, that in the word that had been used, interconnected and holistic, and many other such notions, terms, are completely representative of the reality. And furthermore, then, in regards to what had been said, that as such, highly suggesting that environmental assessments need to respond in kind. No practitioner would disagree with that premise, but we run into an issue then. As these completely understandable, needed matters arise, they cannot be allowed to continue in the way that they are until such time that there is adequate understanding, as I've mentioned. What do they mean? What are we really talking about here? What constitutes the evidentiary standard? And through those questions that I've just posed again, none of that refutes the legitimacy of the fundamentals at play as expressed by these terms. It, however, is a completely, in most instances, different matter from sitting down and actually trying to prepare an assessment to address these. So where to go from here? Well, certainly, notwithstanding some of the suggestions and notions across the board that I put forward, and certainly by no stretch are they all, and they certainly only represent one voice and indirectly a collective voice. But we need an improved collaborative effort to, and I'll conclude on this in answering to the question. Every time such, again, completely understandable, reasonable notions are put forward, they have to be tested, and I use the word transmuted, in a fashion that coming out of that interrogation is a fashion that becomes a thing I can assess. Because we don't have that still in many fronts. And we are talking about streamlining here. And for its part, matters of technical practice and this whole matter of evidence, it is my belief, and I believe I'm not the only one in this regards, that until such time an improvement occurs in this way, we will be stuck in what at the moment is an unfortunate version of time consumption in trying to sort these matters out.
Thanks, George. I'm going to ask a question that I had, and then the next question is up from Alan Elric. And Alan, if you wanted to ask your question, like, we can give you access to turn on your mic and camera. The question I had for you, George, is as we know, most projects are approved, sometimes with a pile of conditions, or usually with a pile of conditions. If we were to streamline things to, let's say, a defined period of time, be it a year or something else, do you think that shorter time frame, and in consideration of the precautionary principle that we often bake into our decisions, could lead to conservatively more projects being denied as a result of not having the necessary time? And do you think proponents would be okay with that, the risk associated with?
So another very good question. I will first say that I reject the time-honored indictment that the dominance of project approvals represents an impairment of the entire environmental assessment process. It is, in my view, reflecting a misunderstanding of the environmental assessment process. Yes, most projects are approved. There are reasons for that. In the assessment process, of many good things that come out of it, are means in order to provide the opportunity to, as we know, seek options in order to address what effects may be. And it's a constantly evolving standard forward that way. And I won't even go into, because clearly we do not have time, in arguments of captured regulators and so on and so forth. Unbalanced decision-making is made on the realization of what exists in terms of matters of benefit and contrariwise. I have earlier in other such discussions turned things completely around, and again, for the sake of time, I'll just conclude on this. And what I'm about to say, which I have actually in published form prepared before, and I completely understand why it's really hard to hear this, but it is actually very hard to reject a project. And that doesn't mean that there's subterfuge or fault at play. It's because it takes actually a lot for circumstances to either singularly or collectively result in a situation so evidently and patently clear that it is unacceptable to the point of resulting in a rejection. It is aligned, what I've just said, very much with a similar parallel argument. Why are so few effects concluded as significant? And a good proportion of what I've just said equally applies. And it has to do with in my opinion, notwithstanding is always fully embracing all views. Every view has its legitimate aspect to it. But there are equally reasons why matters unfold that they do. And they are quite clear from a practitioner's point of view, and they are at times perfectly unclear or rejected by others. I understand that. Discussions like this would be invaluable in moving ahead streamlining, because we do not want to compromise the fundamental environmental foundation that we rest on. But of course, there's other matters at play. I'm keeping my eye on the time. And,
thanks, George.
Back to you, Jeff. Yeah,
I'm hoping we can get through at least a couple of more here in the next 4 minutes. So from Alan Elric, good EA is participatory, and good engagement takes time. Making good decisions about large projects often involves considering potential impacts on Indigenous people and their traditional territory. How do you reconcile streamlining assessments with the time it takes to, in all caps, meaningfully and fairly engage Indigenous governments, which often need time to fairly participate, especially when they lack the resources of industry and provincial or federal governments? Getting this wrong, and wouldn't you get this wrong, and wouldn't you risk losing the lengthy court challenges, the time you gain in the simplified EA process?
Thank you, Alan, for that. An excellent comment. I absolutely agree and sympathize with what you say. And I would hazard equally so for other practitioners. And it would pain me to anywhere fall short in the nature of our ability to engage and ensure adequate engagements. Certainly with Indigenous groups, I use that term as a global umbrella. There's many others, and in any community. But, and given the breadth and depth of that comment, again, which I completely believe I understand, but here it is. And in fact, perhaps Jeff, and again, keeping an eye on the time here, segues perhaps into a particular moment in this hour. So what had been just raised by question and commentary just a moment ago, and then with the others, and so many other possibilities. Everyone is absolutely right in expressing concern about streamlining. But here's the thing. Many want it anyway. The government of Canada has declared by the end of this year they will have tangible means to move ahead in that way. Perhaps, yes, for relatively defined situations. Certainly mining projects come to mind with the critical mineral strategy, but not necessarily just that. So here we have it. Here it comes down to it. Yes, yes, yes. And although it may be hard to believe by some, practitioners are right there believing and understanding the concerns. But now what? If something is going to break and change in any shape or form on the banner of streamlining, something has to change. And right now, there are many, many interesting options put forward, none put into effect yet, at least concertedly and explicitly, formally and legally. Maybe none ever will, as in fact examination reveals amongst the relevant parties in such dialogues. We can't make it work. That's very much an option. But if in any shape or form it can, through perhaps, and I would submit, through a variety of individual and intertwined initiatives that then collectively offer at least some opportunity, because we thought about it, we've talked about it, we've sifted through it in order to arrive, but not all instances. And perhaps just conclude that, and again, in terms of what Alan had mentioned, that in what I had presented, has suggested that on the vexing question of, well, how many years is short enough? That if a project takes longer, it's because there is, again, an eminent reason for it. And we have to accept that as well. And there may be very many instances in which so-called streamlining initiatives will give it a try, but it simply may not work in the end. And I think we certainly have run out of time by now, Jeff. I'll pass it back to you to conclude.
Yeah, we will wrap things up, George. Really appreciate you leading this discussion, getting this conversation going. I know there's a number of regulators, industry proponents, and practitioners on the line, and this resonates with all of us. Something needs to be done. We have some big targets ahead of us. I wanted to, on behalf of the IA, IAW, and C board, thank you, George. As a token of our thanks, we will be providing you with a free annual membership, noting that as all good Western Northern practitioners, you already have a membership, and so we'll just extend yours for the next year. And really, if there was one of those applaud buttons like they have on Teams, I would click that and say thank you very much for your time. We will look forward to continuing this conversation and hearing more as it develops. And look forward to streamlining.
And my last comment on the email address here, I encourage anyone, I always have an interest in discussing matters. And if anybody wishes to have any follow-up, please contact me. There's no subject off the table or point of view. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you.